Hello, everyone. So, Mark, what do you think of Nikephoros I?
He's a hard one to judge in many ways because you see, I think, the makings of perhaps someone who could have been a good ruler.
How do you mean?
Well, his reorganisation of the themes in the Balkans, for example, his attempt, so to speak, to get a sort of peace deal with the Franks and Charlemagne.
Yeah.
So it's clear that he has the knowledge of what needs to be done. But unfortunately, his reign, I've always thought, can be characterised by his defeats on the field of battle.
Yes. He is defeated by both the Arabs and especially at the Battle of Pliska in 11.
Where he unfortunately got decapitated and
his head used as a drinking cup.
Yes. Yeah, if it wasn't for his defeats, I would say he was perhaps a decent emperor. But these two defeats, and especially with Pliska and the fact that it throws the empire almost into chaos, means I'm perhaps going to be a tad harsh, but I'm going to put him in incompetent because he clearly lacks competency on the battlefield.
I almost wish I could, if there was a category in between good and decent, I'd put him in there, but I'll put him in decent, and here is why. So, it's true, his military campaigns were often, against the Arabs, were a very mixed bag, and also against the Bulgars, however, he had far more success until the Pliska campaign. But also, he was very successful against Frankish incursions against the Dalmatia and Venetia. At the time, he managed to push them back. He also was responsible for the reconquest of Greece, which brought this region back under imperial control for the first time in 200 years. During that point from Maurice to his reign, 90%, if not more, of Greece was owned by Slavic tribes known as Sclavines or Sclavenia. And so the Romans were boxed into places like Athens and Thessalonica and the immediate environment around it. But the rest of the countryside was owned by the Slavs. And between Irene and him, we see the complete reconquest of Greece and also the settlement of these areas by large numbers of Anatolians. So you have the re-Hellenization of the area as well. The whole province is reintegrated into the empire and remains a part of the empire until the fall of Constantinople in 1204, where it gets carved up between the Epirot Latins. He's responsible for first major conquests for quite a long time, but he's also responsible for one of the biggest disasters in Byzantine military history, full stop, Pliska. It ranks alongside battles like Adrianople, Manzikert, and stuff like that. But I think if you were to ignore his internal reforms, it would be a great injustice to what he was trying to do. So Irene, one of the issues why she was deposed was because she'd been spending all of the money. Unsurprisingly, her finance minister, Nikephoros, leads a coup, which actually gets Irene out of a very sticky situation she was starting to find herself in, kind of locked between the power of two of her eunuchs. And Nikephoros drains the swamp. He institutes a census. I think it's the first census of the empire since Leo III. He abolishes all tax exemptions. So there's a complete rewrite of the book for the empire's finances. And I think also, perhaps one of his biggest initiatives would be his vexations. So the vexations of Nikephoros I, which are 10 points of reform, is perhaps one of the reform programs you ever get in the Byzantine Empire. You have large resettlement of population in the empire. Tradesmen get issued land and they have to with interest, and they have to repay the land, so encouraging investment in the coast. You have the reform of recruitment, so now the obligation for a soldier's equipment and supplies becomes the duty of the whole village community rather than just their household. As I say, I think there are a lot of reasons why Nikephoros I could be a good emperor. I mean, if you were judging him on his administrative points alone, I think he'd definitely be a good emperor, maybe even a great emperor. But also you have to weigh that down with military failure. He has a lot of revolts and mutinies from the army. He causes controversy in the church when he promotes one of his secretaries to patriarch. These are the kinds of things that kind of make him go down into the mediocre, maybe even incompetent area. So I've put him in decent as a compromise. He's definitely a controversial emperor.
I half want to revise, if I may. I'll move him up one into mediocre. His legacy, which I think is key here, aside, his organisation of the themes into what we all know and love is one of his legacies. His other legacy is another half century of turmoil. So I think he is mediocre, just so I don't seem to perhaps be a bit too harsh.
Indeed. Unfortunately, Pliska did happen. Apart from his skull being turned into a drinking cup, and the vast majority of the Roman army being completely destroyed, his son Staurakios is fatally wounded during the battle. He's hit in the spine, which paralyzes him from the waist down, and for the next few months, the empire is in a state of uncertainty. You have factions that want to proclaim Staurakios emperor. You have factions that want to proclaim his brother-in-law Michael Rangabe emperor. The army is the decisive factor in this point, in that the commander proclaims Staurakios emperor to put an end to the uncertainty in the hopes that he will recover. He never does, and he spends the next few months in bed and trying to smooth over relations with many of the enemies that his father had made during his reign, such as the church. Eventually, when it's clear that he won't recover, Staurakios tries to make his wife his heir to the throne, which is quite interesting. Theophano, she is a relative of Irene. He also wants his brother-in-law Michael to be blinded, to cut him out of the succession, and the army and his opponents won't wear it, so they decide to proclaim Michael emperor instead, and Staurakios is forced to abdicate. I'm not quite sure where to put Staurakios. I think it's very much against it. He is able to act, but because of his wound, he is unable to put his words into deeds. And so he is hamstrung by the fact that the Roman court needs someone to be able to be a man of action, and Staurakios is unable to do that. I mean, I would be very interested to have seen what happened had he been able to transfer the empire to his wife, but that's not what happened. I don't know, I think I would put him as a mediocre emperor. I don't think he's unrankable, because you do see action. I don't think he's necessarily incompetent, because it's not the things he was trying to do were he blundered into them or stuff like that, or were any great benefit. It's just that they couldn't happen because he was not the driving seat of his reign. I think mediocre is perhaps the best place to put him. What do you think, Mark?
I have also placed him in mediocre.
Okay.
I think when you consider that his reign is effectively, 2 and a bit months of him slowly dying.
Yeah.
He's clearly getting less and less well before he is obviously deposed, which I'm sure we'll get to in a sec. But when you do consider that, and you consider that he was governing the empire from his bedchamber, I do think that he did, as good a job as one could expect, I think, under those circumstances. I mean, dare I say, 2 and a bit months doesn't really leave much time for any heroic deeds or glorious campaign, or even any systematic reorganization of the empire. But I think that for the time he had, he kept the wheels of state turning. And so I have also placed him in mediocre.
He reminds me of Constantine III in a way, in that he was doomed from the start.
Mm.
Someone who wasn't necessarily doomed from the start was Michael I, who I feel no compunction in putting him in bad. I say this for 2 reasons. The first is that he starts giving money out to everyone that wanted it. So you have a small reverse of Nikephoros' policies. It's not enough to end the empire or anything, but you see the church regain its former powerful position under him, whereas Nikephoros I had managed to curtail its power quite a bit, which feeds into why people hated him so much, or at least in the sources, because all of these sources are written by the same people he was forcing to pay taxes. And Michael Rangabe was doing the opposite. So he often gets quite a good write-up, even despite the rest of his reign. He was a bit of a blunderer, really. It's important to remember that the empire was not a homogeneous whole in terms of its population. Apart from different ethnicities and creeds, you also have people of different religions. So the majority religion is, of course, Christianity. But you also have Jews and also heretics, such as the Athenagans and Paulicians in the empire, which, although were second-class citizens, were still citizens. And when the Patriarch asked the Emperor to begin to convert some of these populations to Christianity, Michael thinks it's the best idea to begin persecuting them. And then the Patriarch comes back completely horrified by what he's doing, and then Michael immediately stops. So he's not a very good ruler. And also he's a giant coward. So when the fallout of the Battle of Pliska is the Bulgars are able to roam around in the Balkans, I think there is part of the reason why they're not able to act so quickly upon the defeat of Pliska. In fact, it's 2 years before they even really get going again in 813, is that Nikephoros, before the actual Battle of Pliska, he had absolutely hammered the Bulgarians into submission. And so it takes a couple of years before things get going again. Krum turns up and he starts burning down a few towns, which have been left fairly defenseless. And Michael initially wants to try and make peace with Krum, which is probably the best thing to do at this point, to peace, rebuild, and come back again. Instead, he's persuaded by some of his court, people like Theodore the Studite and so on, to declare war, because Krum is taking Christians prisoner. So Michael, who always listens to his advisors, decides to continue the war and decides to meet Bulgars and march out to a place called Versinikia, where one of his commanders, a guy called John Aplakis, gets so sick to death of Michael and his incompetence that he decides to attack anyway, hoping that the rest of the army does as well. Michael assembles the army but doesn't do anything. And one of his other commanders, a guy called Leo, decides to pull out. Sometimes it comes across in the sources as a betrayal of Michael and the rest of the army. Leo wants to save what troops he can. Things go drastically wrong. Michael flees. A lot of the army's killed in the pursuit. Troops with John Aplakis and he gets killed by the Bulgars. Michael returns to Constantinople, and the first thing that happens is he's deposed by the army. For those reasons, we can say with some certainty that Michael was a bad ruler. Kind of mirror some of his pals in this category, like Philippicus, Arcadius, Constantine VI. It's just the level of stupidity is ridiculous. What do you think, Mark?
I do agree with you. Michael is undoubtedly, I think, a bad emperor. For me, a lot of you've summed up his reign quite well. The only other thing I would perhaps add is he managed to undermine his own office by recognising Charlemagne as imperator, which, whilst perhaps it doesn't really mean much that he did it, especially if you look at it from the Byzantine nobility's point of view, undermine the dignity of both himself and the office which subsequent people would hold by recognising another person as an imperator who's outside the empire. But aside from that diplomatic misstep, I think, should also be taken into account. So I also do put him as a bad emperor.
What do you think of Leo V, Mark?
When Crum attacks Constantinople, I think I recall Leo V being quite a treacherous so-and-so towards Crum, and tries to kill him during the peace negotiations, which is a curious move. I believe he did get peace in the end with the Bulgars. I believe in 815. I think because he won a series of victories against them, and
I believe it's 816, the Battle of Leo's Hill.
816, which is also it's to his credit. The most interesting thing about him, though, is his assassination. It's one of those stories I've always found quite. His assassins show a interesting incompetency. For Leo V, I'm quite inclined to put him as a mediocre emperor, verging on decent. Mainly because he manages to settle the Bulgar crisis for a while, which gives the empire time. Obviously, he also, I believe, reinstituted iconoclasm, rearing of that schism once again, perhaps not to his credit. All in all, I would say he was a mediocre emperor, verging on decent.
I thought I would open my piece about Leo V by reading a little bit from a chap called John Skylitzy. So he didn't like Leo that much because he was an iconoclast, as you said. But he did have this to say about him, which gives a idea of what people thought about Leo V, and also an idea of what he did during his reign. Because he is an iconoclast, there is an element of mystery. So he says, in spite of such impiety and criminality, he was extremely vigilant in his handling of state affairs, to the point that nothing necessary or useful was left unattended to. They say, too, that after his death, the patriarch Nikephoros opined that, although the Roman state had indeed lost an irreligious ruler in Leo, he was nevertheless a great one, and in addition to his diligent and attentive administration of public business, he was the implacable foe of those who acted unjustly. Thus, one day, as he was leaving the palace, a man came up to him and complained that a member of the Senate had taken his wife away. I complained to the prefect of the city about this, but received no satisfaction. Having heard what the man said, the emperor immediately ordered the accused senator and the prefect to appear before him when he returned. Immediately, when he was home again, the aggrieved man who sought justice, the one who had committed the alleged deed, and the prefect himself, appeared before him. When the emperor commanded the plaintiff to relate what had befallen him, the man explained the matter from beginning to end. As for the one, and could see that he was hemmed in on every side by the allegations against him, he confessed his transgression. When the emperor asked the prefect why he had not awarded a fitting punishment for this crime, he was struck dumb and incapable of offering any excuse. So the emperor dismissed him from his office. He handed the adulterer over to suffer the punishments prescribed by law. For most of the time, the emperor used to sit in the Mosaic Hall, appointing commanders, generals, and governors, choosing them from among the most worthy and incorruptible of men, being disdainful of money, and very parsimonious himself. I think that Leo V I think he's one of those kind of fits in between decent and good for me.
No!
And decent just for now, and see if I change your mind, Mark. But so a few things about Leo V. The first is that at the beginning of his reign, it's only because Crum died and a subsequent succession crisis in the Bulgar Empire that he has any respite. And then when they come back in 816, he is able to crush the Bulgar army at the Battle of Leo's Hill in a very clever bit of deception. Piece they arrange for that. So it's true that he loses most of the areas of Thrace that Irene and Nikephoros had recently gained. But on the other hand, the rest of it he was able to secure and passed out of being threatened by the Bulgars for some time. In fact, the peace agreement that he makes with the Bulgars in 816 lasts right up until 896 or 97, where Simeon the Great and Leo VI declare war on each other. So you have nearly 80 years of peace in the Balkans. You have the odd small conflict, typically when the treaty gets renewed. So the treaty lapses, and then they do a couple of things, like Theophilus grabs the Strymon Valley back and stuff like that. But by the end of the year, they renew their peace for the next 10, 20 years, etc. Leo is responsible for that. He has some successes in the east against the Arab Caliphate. As we heard from John Skylitzes, he reforms the administration. I suspect that he gets rid of all of the corrupt practices that have been seeping in the reign of Michael I, appointing men of good character and so on. His iconoclasm is interesting. It shows two things. Well, the first thing is that Leo was not an iconoclast before he became emperor. Told this. And also, he's the only other emperor in Byzantine history to be called the Apostate as a nickname. So in the Logothete, in his chronicle, he calls him Leo the Armenian and Apostate because of his iconoclasm. So Leo, he thinks that iconoclasm is the reason why being able to get victory. He attributes all of the recent defeats by the iconophile emperors. It gets a second wind under Leo V, a grassroots revival of it in people like Leo, who attribute their recent losses to the switch from iconoclasm to iconophilism. And it is perhaps understandable because you have people like Leo III, Constantine V, and Leo IV, who were very successful iconoclast emperors. His falling down comes from his arrest of Michael the Amorian, who is quite obscure why he arrested him, but it happened, and he got unlucky. He would have had him blinded and executed, but because Christmas was the following day, he decided to put it off to the day afterwards, which was a fatal mistake. He doesn't reign for very long, and his successes are quite moderate. But at the same time, he's a very important emperor. He stabilizes the situation that's been left after Plisca and Versinikia, and you have a continuance of this revival internally. So I think he is a decent emperor at the very least. What do you think, Mark? Have I managed to change your opinion about him at all?
In my own defence here, I did say that he's bordering on decent. I will, but yeah, you've convinced me enough to push him into decent. Still something a bit off about him in my mind, but
Okay.
yes, I will put him into decent, alongside his namesake predecessor Leo IV.
And there we are. That is the Nikephoran dynasty and Leo V. So next time we'll be talking about the Armorian dynasty, Michael II, Theophilus, and Michael III. Thank you very much, Mark, for coming along. It's very interesting to hear what you had to say.
Thank you for having me.
And I will see you all again soon. And this has been Eastern Roman History.